Hello, Amelia. So glad you joined us. And this is actually the first time we're meeting face to face
hmm
because our last experience and our first experience was on Clubhouse. And what attracted me to your session with Howard Teich was actually the title. It was about luminaries and archetypes, and the whole session was very attractive. I met some wonderful people. So, because we weren't really properly introduced, we just fell into a conversation. Can you just tell me and our audience about yourself and your background and your trajectory that brought you to this moment?
Hi, yeah, of course. So my name is Amelia Lichtenberg, and I am currently a student getting into an art therapy program with an end goal of working in psychedelic art therapy. So combining psychedelic therapy with art therapy, and mostly for PTSD and other types of trauma healing and identity reintegration post trauma healing. Um, so a big part of my journey with that present, past, and future is that I speak about and educate people on the relating dynamic known as relationship anarchy. It's also known as conscious relating. And essentially, it is more of a social movement practice that is um, based in creating relationship structures based in agreements as opposed to expectations and rules, and prioritizing relationships based on context rather than based on things like romantic entanglement or sexual involvement. And I teach about this in both a monogamous minded framework as well as non-monogamous frameworks, but it really does apply to all relationships, not just romantic ones. And so that's a huge part of my own personal philosophy, as well as one of the things that has motivated me to coming into this space of talking with people about relating in inwards and outwards, and getting into the therapy world. I'm also a painter, and I've used painting and creative expression as my own personal therapy. So going into the field of art therapy was a natural step in that direction.
Well, so cool. There's so many threads there that I want to draw on. I need to sit back and contemplate which to start with. So one of them, the idea of relationship anarchy. Initially it sounds um, very chaotic, but then you used a term that suddenly relaxed it. Now I'm forgetting what the term was. Relationship,
Conscious relating.
conscious relating.
Yeah.
Those seem like two very, very different concepts. So how is conscious relating anarchic?
So when we look at the actual definition of anarchy, it means without hierarchy and without rule. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
violence, it doesn't mean aggression, even though those tend to be considered synonymous, or anti-authoritative in an aggressive way. It just means non-hierarchical and without ruler. So
Got it.
the definition of anarchy, relationship anarchy, makes sense, but because of the way culturally we think about anarchy, that's why myself and a few other individuals in this field that I know have also included terms like conscious relating, authentic relating, mindful relating as well, to give a more poignant description of what it means.
I like that. So it sounds like it's more about relating deeply, authentically, and with an almost unlimited possibility space when the two or more parties are willing not to exert an authority over each other. Um, does that fit?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I like to use the imagery of it creates relationship landscapes rather than relationship escalators.
Mm,
So within these containers, anything is possible. Things can be reworked in any direction, and none of it is bad. None of it is, it's all good. It's just a matter of two people coming into an authentic agreement, two people meeting in voluntary co-willing spaces for whatever that agreement is and however it shifts over time. The thing that I really love about relationship anarchy is that it leaves room for the fact that the only constant in life is change, and that people change and things change, and that that's okay. And I personally haven't found another relationship structure or relationship ideology that really takes that into consideration, because that is a core part of relationship anarchy, is understanding that things are going to change and that's okay.
I really like that. Um, my wife and I went to an Imago relationship program, um, which we found very profound. It was a really interesting program because it kind of tricked us into seeing aspects of ourselves and each other that we appreciated that we hadn't really seen. It's sort of like almost a two yeah, I mean, it really was kind of a trick because it wound up getting underneath or behind our ego resistance of the things that we were fighting against because we didn't want to see them in ourselves, sort of past our blind spots. And it created a way to really open up and communicate. So I know, uh, I can imagine that um, this would even be a step beyond that in terms of acceptance and recognition of a full person that you're relating with and um not just seeing parts of them and parts of you. So that sounds super cool. um
Mm,
there were there were really there I saw your introduction as a constellation of a couple points. I'd like you to sort of connect those together for me. So you have
sure.
your painting, your own visual art.
Mhm.
You have therapy and art therapy. You have psychedelics, and you have relationships. Um, how does this fit together as a practice or
Mhm.
a profession or a how do you work? I know you said you're still a student of the art therapy, but how does this sort of come together in terms of how you work with clients, other people in what's the setting like?
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. So, first, the art that I do is also very highly psychedelic. So there's a tie between the psychedelics and the art already. And then also my personal worldview, and therefore my views on relationships and relating and interpersonal dynamics are also enlightened by my own psychedelic experiences. So psychedelics has ties to both of these worlds individually. Where they all meet together in this space is, as far as therapy goes, I'm a lot more interested in expressive arts therapy, so movement-based therapy, dance therapy. Visual art therapy can also be really nice, but I tend to be more of a somatic person myself, and so I like to use those kinds of modalities with other people. And then because I want to work with trauma individuals or trauma survivors, and a lot of the types of trauma that I will be working with are like sexual assault and rape survivors. And so there's a lot of material regarding relationships and how we relate to our outer environment within that structure, of healing that trauma. It's also healing that ability to relate to people. And so I've found that, somatics expressive arts therapy is really good for helping get that energy out. It's helpful to get into the body, out of the mind, and using that as a way of processing the emotions. And the psychedelics also help with perception. It helps with getting into that more body-based experiential moment by moment perception. So on the one hand, it helps with the art itself and informing the art that's being used as therapy. And then it also opens the mind to be more receptive to these ideas about, acceptance, or we'll just say grand acceptance, or honoring that I am an individual autonomous person and it's okay to be alone sometimes, like
Mm-hmm.
that. And that other people are also individual people who will make their own choices, sometimes good and sometimes not. And I think that psychedelics really help cultivate a compassionate space of acceptance for any individual, especially when guided properly, an individual who struggles with relational based trauma. So
Did
I hope
ha-
that answered your question.
no, absolutely. It was an amazing answer. I just have this total practical question of, paperwork. I mean, one of the people I'm working with, one of my clients, um, who our audience is also meeting at this summit, um, I dubbed her the licensed clinical miracle worker because she's she has managed to work within the social services framework in a fairly conservative, traditional way, but really brought a lot of essentially relationship anarchy to bear within this. um, so I'm curious how and I know you're in the Bay Area. I don't know if you're quote allowed to practice therapy with psychedelics, but I have friends in LA who are doing ketamine therapy. I know that this is becoming more common, but just how does it work? I mean, just from the practical standpoint of providing psychedelics to your clients.
Right. That's always the question. I'm actually in Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
Um, so we just passed a measure on our ballot that legalizes psilocybin therapy.
I read about that. Okay, super cool.
And that's as far as the psychedelics go, which the ones that are legal to work with in a therapeutic setting at this time, including this psilocybin in Oregon, are psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine. Um,
Mm,
and then cannabis is sometimes considered a psychedelic, but isn't. It's not really the same kind of
it
deal.
doesn't do the job.
Yeah. But so the next 2 years are the incubation time, so to speak, where the certification process and regulations and growing process and regulations will be established.
Mm,
The measure 109, the significant thing about it is that it made psilocybin therapy something that is outside of the clinical model and the educational model. So it's not something you need a certain level of degree for. It's not something that you need a prescription for. You can, once this goes through, any person over the age of 21 can just go into a psilocybin clinic for a psilocybin session for whatever purpose. It doesn't have to
wow,
be for a psychopathological purpose or to
that's
treat,
so amazing.
which is really significant. And so there's a lot of questions in the air about what does it mean to be certified? What will those clinics look like? What is going to be okay? What isn't going to be okay? How are we going to screen people? All of that sort of thing. So I can't quite answer that question on that level because psilocybin is the main molecule that I plan to work with. However, as far as MDMA goes, and that's used in couples therapy a lot, and something I'm open to adopting into my practice as well, is from what I understand, you administer the client MDMA, usually in some sort of capsule form. And then it's different for clinics. Sometimes in the early studies, it's been they're kind of sitting in like a hospital bed because you're also monitoring their vitals and all of that stuff and just
Mhm.
talking to them. Other studies and research environments with psychedelics have been, in something like a living room setting or like a standard therapy office where you have low lighting, a nice comfy couch, blah, blah, blah. You have two observers. So I wouldn't think it'd be too much different for my particular modality. It would look like a room with space to move around, some sort of comfy seating area, and then also art supplies that
Wow.
will be free to just grab whatever art supplies they want, start drawing, painting, whatever. Um, and I also am interested in working with a lower dose. Most research and psychedelic therapy is done with higher doses. So you have maybe 1 or 2 sessions with a high dose of psilocybin, and that's your treatment plus pre and post integration. Um, and for me, it's more of a longer term, smaller doses so that you still have some sort of cognitive function to be able to take some direction. Like, do you want to draw now or paint or, things like that.
And integrate. Yeah, I can see that.
So I think before it really comes to fruition, there's going to be some calls for more research in that area of longer term effects of lower doses before it can be a solidified practice. But that's how I see
Wow.
it going.
I mean, this is so on the cutting edge of consciousness. It's really amazing. That's what, um, and it's funny for me because so much of what I'm putting together, I think about what if my 16-year-old self had had this, and like how isolated I was in, suburban high school reading. I mean, reading Hunter S. Thompson and Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And, we would go out in the woods with our delay pedals and microphones and day glow paints, and try and recreate these things that we read about. And, I remember making tapes and calling them um, Jungian analysis for psychedelic tapes, like literally cassettes. I would sit in the basement with vinyl and this cassette deck and take things like JFK's speeches and Al Jolson and Simon and Garfunkel and whatever, and like snip them up in different ways so that when we were all tripping, we would have these different random sensory inputs that all would then flow with whatever the conversations we're having and would sort of alert different things. And like, I was like, this is how it should be done. This was what, 1982, 1983. And
Yeah.
and now suddenly the world's catching up and saying,
A pioneer on the
like, yeah,
trail.
it's
That's
so funny.
awesome. The
Uh,
and I think that's where what a lot of DJs do nowadays is sample. They'll sample things like in Alan Watts talk or Terrence McKenna or Alex Gray,
exactly.
bigger names in psychedelics, and they'll put them in whatever crazy electronic sounds that they're making, and then they'll just slide in this little bit of a lecture from this person, this profound quote from a movie or something. And yeah, it absolutely changes the direction of the conversation and opens up a new well to go, a new rabbit hole to go
Right, right.
in the perception.
No, I can so see that. And I just remember the cuddle puddles. I mean, um, ecstasy just, I mean, really just started when I was in college. I mean, I guess I remember 1985, like taking Metro North down to New York City, taking the subway to NYU, going to some knocking on some dorm room that someone had told me, "If you go to this dorm room, you can buy some E," and bring it back. And then meanwhile, like, all of my gay friends were raving about ketamine, Special K, that they would go to New York to different clubs and, um, it's just so interesting that like, it's just interesting to me that it is actually being, I don't know if put to use is the right word, but there is this integration of medical models and cultural models that seem to fit. And that's really the theme of this whole summit is possibility space and in particular shared experiences. And what I'm discovering is that the world is actually farther along. Our culture, our society is actually farther along than I thought. I mean, does this give you hope that there's now openings for these types of things?
Definitely, absolutely. I truly believe that the emergence of psychedelics into the mainstream culture will be humanity's saving grace.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because one of my mentors who Howard Teich actually also introduced me to, he's a big connector in this in this environment. Um, Four Arrows. Uh we've talked a lot about what's currently happening in Central and South America with ayahuasca. And I actually have a very good friend around here who brews his own ayahuasca in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, of all places. Um, and
Of all
uh,
places.
right. We call it Mayberry on acid. That's kind of that's our
Love
little pet
it.
name for our town. It's only a couple thousand people. So, um, the interesting thing is his practice he calls cat fawn for concentration activated transformation, which is a form of metacognitive trance-based therapy. And that's the cat, and the fawn is fear, authority, words, and nature. And we've been working together to build a program because he's written 20 or edited 23 books. He's been, a professor for decades. He's coached world champion athletes and all this, but he never put it together in something that you could learn and then replicate. Um, and in our conversation, he, um, because he does a lot of traditional medicine, both Lakota medicine, and then also he lives in Mexico half the year and Vancouver the other half of the year. Um, we were talking about the fact that it really only is a time difference that the molecules allow things to happen much faster. So that if you had the stamina of the patients, the time, the willingness to work through all of these things without the introduction of those molecules, you certainly could, but it's more the scale at which we've displaced our indigenous psyche, starting with, and this is, another Howard revelation for me, really starting with Romulus killing Remus and going from there to you really have to suppress the lunar, suppress the unconscious everywhere. So what the druids knew about datura and all these different plants, mugwort, bringing the dream work out, you know, got to get rid of that everywhere they went. Then the New World too get rid of it, put the infrastructure in place. What's really interesting is that for me, that bicycle ride um, of Albert Hoffman, where within the confines of Sandoz, to me, it was sort of the flip moment where this whole infrastructure that had been built, the roads, the aqueducts, the electrification, the scientific experimentation, all this stuff that had suppressed and repressed, it's like all of a sudden it was flipped as a distribution mechanism. So the CIA was distributing acid to Ken Kesey. And it really brought me to think that at some point there is absolutely no reason that the Navy couldn't be recommissioned to be like Greenpeace. And every single one of these infrastructure elements could deliver consciousness instead of delivering oppression and suppression. So that's what I'm seeing from what you're explaining in this Portland experiment. That there's just a really huge new possibility space opening up.
Absolutely. And as far as myself and my colleagues in the psychedelic world, we are all very, well, I'll just speak for myself, but I'm very excited and optimistic about what this will do for our society and culture as a whole, bringing it back to relationship anarchy. A big thing I see in my work and that I work with clients with is dismantling these traditional structures of how you are supposed to relate to another person. And oftentimes I see, especially with female bodied, female identifying, heteronormative type individuals, or at least when they are engaging in more heteronormative relationship structures, so women with men, um, there's this pattern of you have your friends until you find a partner, and then you let go of your friends, and it's just you and your partner in this bubble. And that can breed all sorts of things like codependency, isolation, its own form of trauma, and it's its own form of perpetuating the capitalist, individualist, every person for themselves mentality, which is what all of these structures of oppression are built on top of. There's no other reason for these structures of oppression other than for the gaining of material wealth, or the gaining of the concept of material wealth, and to give that a construct to be in. And to, you have to have context. If you're wealthy, that means there's what something isn't wealthy, and
Right.
otherwise you don't have a concept. And so what psychedelics help with is just completely deconstructing that. And when guided properly, and this is why I think psychedelic therapy is so important, is because then you have trained professionals going in and helping properly guide an individual to their own conclusions.
Mhm.
It's not subliminal messaging. It's not that I'm whispering, be a relationship anarchist to you, but you bring an idea to me that you're struggling with. I'm just not sure about this thing. Why can't I relate to people? Da 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 da. And you're in this more open-minded space, and I can say, well, think about this, and then they can truly think about that, because ego's gone, deflection's gone, and it's much easier in those spaces with all of those molecules, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, to see things from an objective point of view and a compassionate point of view. And so, yeah, I think it, and the research has shown lasting effects from these therapies that blow any other treatments out of the water. Just totally,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. No question. What about the well, I have two questions. I'm trying to think of the order. Okay. I'll do it this way. What about the reaction formation of and the threat from the global empire that you talked about the reason these um, structures were put in place were about the amassing of fortunes and the separation. We've with generations and generations and millennia of the reification of that type of hierarchy that then from a very early age becomes part of so many people's praxis. How does this not just get suppressed like everything else that you
Mm.
know um no, just the big no,
Mhm.
from
Yeah,
the universe.
that's a great question, and that's a question that a lot of people on Clubhouse are discussing at during these times all over the world, especially here in the US, both coasts, um, showing up in these very large rooms to talk about this particular thing. And what I'm seeing happen, especially through the networking that's happening in Clubhouse, is a lot of people who were at the forefront of the cannabis industry with its rise and fall. Um, they have a lot of very passionate feelings about what happened with cannabis and are very passionately dedicated to volunteering within the context of psilocybin to make sure that that doesn't happen with psilocybin. So
So explain what happened.
structures get wiser, so do we.
Mhm.
you know, the
What
commercialization
Yeah,
of
what happened
cannabis.
with cannabis? What's the in a nutshell? What's
Yeah,
considered the because I'm in West Virginia, it never came here, like
yeah,
they
right.
rejected once again, any decriminalization even, whereas our neighboring Virginia just and Maryland and DC, of course, are all, opening it up. But what I have friends in actually I have a cousin in Humboldt County who's a big grower and um a cousin in Seattle who's a big grower, but I didn't know that there was a backlash or a change or something happened in the industry that is considered a learning experience.
Yeah, and I wasn't very involved in the cannabis industry personally because cannabis just isn't a plant that really speaks to me. So my knowledge about this is pretty rudimentary, but I do have a lot of friends who are in that category of pioneers of the cannabis industry, who were directly affected by these things. And in Oregon, this didn't really happen. This is more of a thing that happened in California. But basically, as far as I understand, um, within the legalization process, there were also some, it was mostly a matter of lobbyists and certain big corporations buying rights to genetic strains, that kind of thing, like corporatized
Mm,
of cannabis
got it.
early on, so that then when it blew up, there would be this sort of, you know, uh, corporates would own most of the industry, and all these small independent farmers were getting raided, arrested, thrown in prison,
Wow.
that kind of thing. And there, within, especially within like the Humboldt County area, there was a lot of almost almost it was like weed gang kind of stuff. You just have some, people holding trimmers hostage because you're in the middle of the woods, and using them for free labor.
Yeah,
Got really corrupt, really corrupt.
got it.
But as far as I understand, the root cause of why that happened was because there was an entryway for big corporations to buy genetic strains or to buy some sort of aspect of the cannabis, whether it was land or something, to then basically run the rule system, run the legal system regarding cannabis, drive all the independent people out, and then be the only thing. And that's why, um, when people discuss cannabis, people tend to look at Oregon and go more towards Oregon because there's not, that didn't really happen. So you also have better quality plant products because you're not
Mm,
corporation made, you know, pharma kind of cannabis, but
mm,
quality products. And so there's already been corporations trying to buy the rights to the psilocybin compounds and like the synthetic psilocybin compounds, specifically, which are being, denied and fought back by. And the thing about Measure 109 that's really key is that it discusses, this is within the scope of grown fungi
mm.
mushrooms, not just synthetic psilocybin. This is talking about psilocybin therapy from fungi. So,
Got it.
and there's no way to, at this time, patent a spore, and that's not something that I think is going to really happen, especially because with what happened in the cannabis industry, the people on the non-corporate side of the scale are making sure to block those access points for corporations.
That makes sense. Yeah, and cannabis has always been much more associated with recreation than um, consciousness or therapy, or it seems less likely that there would be a mass market for psilocybin in the same way as a mass market for cannabis. Um,
Right.
I could be wrong, but it seems like the greed factor is less likely to take hold, you
Yeah, the
know.
thing with psilocybin is, first of all, the law states that, or the measure states that it's legal to participate in psilocybin therapy, and it's legal under whatever the credentials that they come up with in these next 2 years to grow psilocybin for that purpose of giving it to a therapy clinic. Um, but it's not something that will become just available in a drugstore, like how people thought cannabis would. Someday you can just buy a pack of joints, you know, gas station, which, is, I don't think we're quite there, but
Right.
basically, um,
Yeah.
but yeah, there isn't really a recreational tie, even though cannabis did also start out with a medical cannabis before the recreational cannabis happened. I don't really think, just because psilocybin's not really something, the nature of it isn't really conducive to recreation in the sense of casualness. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, I think people going into psychedelic experiences to explore their own mind is a great form of recreation, and probably more people would benefit from that kind of recreational activity than some of the other recreational activities we prioritize. But that's also not a casual thing. You don't just, oh, today I'm going to take mushrooms and go about my day just because I feel like it. It's,
Hmm.
if you do that, you might have a challenging time getting anything done, or you might be met with a lot of resistance. So I think just the nature of it will protect itself. Um, as far as ketamine and MDMA go, those ones are already in the medical model because they are synthetic by nature. Um, and so it's a little more complicated, but I don't really know if those will have any sort of corporatized fate. I'm on
Hmm.
too well read on what's going on with those ones at the moment regarding that.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, it's super interesting. So the other thread that I've been wondering, since you mentioned the Portland area as one localized model, and it sounds like while the legal frameworks haven't been necessarily established on the East Coast and other places in the world where people are having these conversations. Is there is your sense that this type of therapy could actually work online? So, for example, if there was somebody in West Virginia who happened to have a bag of shrooms, could you could you see applying um, a therapeutic model and guiding somebody um, with an app or some way? It's I'm curious, but I'm curious about it for a reason. Because as I mentioned, I keep transporting myself back to, wow, what if when I was 16, you know, the world had been like this? Like I could find people like, instead of being trapped in your either suburbia or rural or urban or whatever your, the closed unit is. So I'm just wondering how that might play into this dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Um, See, that one's tricky for a couple reasons, partially because of state to state regulations. So, both on the medical side or the substance side of things, of the state to state regulations regarding mushrooms. Um, and also the state to state regulations regarding licensing. So technically, if I'm licensed to practice therapy here in Portland or in the state of Oregon, that means I'm not licensed to practice in Washington. I'm not licensed to practice in California or anywhere else, including, unfortunately, West Virginia. And I think that this is something I'm not entirely sure about yet because I haven't gone through that licensing process for therapy. But I'm pretty sure that the client needs to also be living or be a resident of the state in which you're licensed to practice in. Um, I think that is a part of it. So on that level, I don't think it's entirely possible. Also, I think that it's more beneficial to have someone in person if you're just asking, can you be a sitter for someone having a psychedelic experience virtually? I would say the best that you could do is you could guide someone who's sitting for someone.
Mm,
So, say you have a bag of mushrooms and you want me to sit for you, but I'm here in Oregon and you're in West Virginia, but your wife is willing to be an intermediary, then
mm,
there you could use an app or something to have, okay, like I can just be there and be present like I would be sitting for you. But if there's anything where a physical person is needed, whether it's to hold hand or to say something, because the difference between hearing something on a computer versus hearing something in person and feeling someone's energy, especially in a heightened state, is the difference is just insurmountable. So um, there,
yeah,
that would be the best way I could see. However, that would have to be more of an informal practice, and I don't think it would work
sure.
in legal sense until it's a federally, you know,
Yeah.
you're an actual United States.
Right, right. No, that's really important. And the reason I was asking is because in that spectrum, I totally agree that the method of people in the same time and place um experiencing this with, one guide, one or more um clients. My two of my children are music therapists. My oldest one is Zoe is licensed and she practices in the Anne Arundel County school system. But since COVID, she's also been doing a lot of practicing online and she does stuff for kids and all kinds of stuff. My son still, he's graduating from college and he's starting his internship this summer. Um, And I think about the fact that how online shared experiences open up the world to people all over that don't have access to local music therapists. I mean, it just they might, or art therapists, or relationship anarchists, or psychedelic therapists. I don't even mean in exploring this, I'm not really even that attached to the psilocybin part of it, but it seems that having access to you, um, and the way you just described it, essentially becoming, and maybe there would wind up being levels. Like, so I'm, um, some sort of relationship anarchy coach. I'm not at the point of being a therapist, but I could still see a pattern where there would be preparation, um, some self-directed, some with you, shared experiences where I still have access to you, but I'm practicing something that's not necessarily regulated. I mean, life coaching isn't particularly regulated.
Mhm.
So you could still benefit somebody locally. And then there's the delivery later. I mean, when I was first breaking myself open and really trying to understand this, I mean, I had the benefit of, it's really funny. I just talked to Claire about part of this story. Um, but I didn't say about the other part. For our 10th anniversary, my wife and I took 2 weeks. We dropped all 3 kids off with my parents. This was 2004. We did 1 week at Esalen and 1 week at Burning Man. Because we said,
Nice.
okay, we're never gonna think I really wish the kids were here. But after that, I really, something awoke in me that I really didn't have since high school. And I found through person after person, some medicine man, or Wakasa Wakan, Ikche Wichacha, where I could just fly out to Rapid City, rent a car, go be on the reservation, and learn so much about plant medicine, ceremony, all these things that were happening, participate in ceremony, grow, and all that. um, I recognize how privileged that is. So part of this is, I've always had this image or concept that part of this wiring of communications is so that the 16-year-old me that is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, and Okinawa, and Kiev, has those connections. So I do, even if it's not within the same legal framework, I am wondering about, with your experience on Clubhouse, with your experiences on Zoom, with these experiences, how much you think this is going to become more of a network and less of a quilt patchwork of different things happening in different places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And so outside of the previous scenario in which somebody is cybernetically sitting for someone actively in a psychedelic space, um, I think that I totally agree with what you've said about online community and connecting these different networks. And I've seen it all throughout the pandemic. I've experienced it all throughout the pandemic. Actually, after our call, I'm going to jump into a women's integration circle for the Portland Psychedelic Society. It's called the Portland Psychedelic Society, but we get people who are not in even the state of Oregon. So it is more expansive. Um, and yeah, and what I wanted to say about psychedelic spaces and in the cybernetic world is that integration is something that for a long time has been really underrated and undervalued as part of the therapeutic process. And absolutely, you can do psychedelic integration remotely. You can do psychedelic integration cybernetically. I think that in this framework that you're talking about of having access to people with knowledge through these means, yeah, absolutely. You can pop into a call or a workshop where somebody is grabbing people out of the audience and doing a little, okay, give me this psychedelic experience that you've had. We're going to workshop it a little bit. And it shows people the tools for how to think about their own experiences and begin unpacking some of the information that they receive in those psychedelic spaces, or pass it on to somebody that they know
Mm,
struggling with that, or who just wants to know more about integration. Um, and the same thing with art therapy, dance therapy, music therapy is a really great example too. You can absolutely do those cybernetically and share in that space. There's totally something to be said there. And I love the scenario that you were describing about, I'm a relationship anarchy life coach, not quite a therapist yet, because that's really where I'm at right now. I do have a few clients that I do coach in an unofficial capacity through relationship stuff as I'm progressing to get my license.
mhm,
I just thought that was really great. And all of that is done remotely as well. Um,
mm,
so it's, yeah, it's totally possible. And seeing the ways that I personally have become so enriched from Clubhouse, our conversations in the luminary archetypes rooms included, in that mix, is just my own personal testament to this understanding, this idea that, yeah, we can definitely start using the internet to unify ourselves and create collectivism on a global scale. Uh,
mm,
and I think that incorporating psychedelics into the Western mindset is really going to help that, because a lot of Eastern mindsets, indigenous mindsets, Afrocentric worldviews already have that basis of collectivism. It's really just us
yeah, yeah,
who
yeah.
don't.
Mm. Well, you know what's so interesting on that? I mean, it really flashes me back to 2004, 2005, when I first had that real awakening that no, I'm not just gonna leave behind my creative, artistic, musical, psychedelic self. Now that I'm married and have 3 kids, I'm going to find a way to bring this together. And that was partially working with Howard Teich, who was my executive coach for over a dozen years. And, um, you know, Standing Cloud and Black Horse and some of the people, who practice indigenous medicine. Um, the mobile phone really opened it up for me. I mean, because every time I would get in the car, I would just press a button with one of them. And it integrated because I couldn't just get to South Dakota or get to Los Angeles and hang out with Howard. But so much of the dream work, so many powerful dreams, I could talk to, and the Lakota term is Ieska, which is interpreter, but it really is an integrator. I mean, before I found ceremony and those ceremonial containers, I was trying all this stuff on my own, but there wasn't, you really, you really do need a guide. I mean, that's just sort of the way humans work. I mean, I tried to do it with books. I tried to read, so we said Terence McKenna and Black Elk and Sitting Bull and Michael Harner and Alan Watts and whatever, read all this stuff and say, okay, I'm going to go figure this out. Right. I couldn't do it. Like as many, I tried so hard, I kept winding up in the hospital or winding up in jail, and it didn't work I until that experience of going to Esalen Institute. And that first workshop was with Bill Plotkin. It was a Soulcraft workshop, which had self-directed ceremony, way of counsel, all these different things that were basically integrative practices Um, and once I actually experienced that, I said to myself, okay, this is you can't do this just with books and records and video. Someone like Bill, who called himself web weaver and would weave cocoons of transformation where people could initiate themselves into the mysteries of their own soul. I said, okay, that's what a guide is. Like I had a shrink in high school who's wonderful, and he got me through 10th, 11th, and 12th grade without completely disintegrating. but it was still a different thing showing up and talking twice a week for 50 minutes and being in an experience with a guide that really integrated your whole body as well as all of nature and life into something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put it so well that there's a huge difference when we're externally processing something by talking it out with another person and when we're just experiencing the thing. Because within those spaces, you come to these same conclusions that maybe you get told in therapy, but it comes to you in an inner knowing, and you don't forget how that feels in your body, what it sounds like in your mind, the reactions, that the way your environment looks when you step into that space. And to me, I feel like that is more sustainable as far as learning goes, and that's also just me. I'm a kinesthetic learner, so I have to do things. I can see it be done, I can hear how to do it, but I have to try it myself in order to really
Mhm,
understand how something works. um and so I think a lot more people are like that than maybe they
mhm,
credit for, but at least that's my perspective, is that that innate, or that like internal experience really just, yeah, it just locks in the message and creates a new space and sensation inside oneself to draw on at any point, whether they are in another altered state or sober. But yeah, it's absolutely, needing a guide or at least a space holder to help if that energy starts to kind of like, oh, go back to center, oh, go back,
yeah.
it's just so helpful, because otherwise we're going to get lost if we don't have a roadmap.
No, I totally get it. And until I actually went to, and this was a very different training, but I went to a training a couple years ago in the UK, and I remember the moment when I actually felt my feelings in a different way. Like, and I recognized what a feeling was. It seems like a really strange thing, but a very good friend of mine who's an author, um, I recommended my old shrink from high school to her because she was going through a real crisis. And she came back one day. She lived in here in Shepherdstown, but she drove down to DC for therapy. And she came back and said, for the first time, I understood what anxiety is. Like, she had had all of these anxiety disorders and just horrific trauma growing up. And her book, I'll actually go ahead and recommend her book because the audience would probably love it. But it's called Dancing with the Octopus. Her name's Deborah Harding, and she was kidnapped and raped at 14 from the parking lot of her school, and went through a whole reconciliation process with her abductor. Um, but she also interwove into this beautiful book trauma from her mom, who had a very severe personality disorder, that she was putting all this stuff together. And it was just so interesting when she came back and just said to me, I actually, I now know what that experience is. I felt it, but now I put a name to it. And it was the same thing that happened to me a few years ago in this training where, okay, this is what it feel. I can actually feel something in my heart, and I feel it now. Like, that's to me the difference of something that once you've experienced it, you can bring it back. right? Once you experience what a particular emotion is, um, then you can invoke it, and you also know when it's not there. And this really is much more about emotions and feelings than it is about mental models and understanding and all this. It's so I can really feel that. I really understand what you're saying. And in this conversation, it really in that last part, it it really settled here in a very different way. Like I really I feel your gifts and what you're bringing to
Oh,
all of these people, and really believe it's going to grow.
oh, thank you. Now I feel it in my chest.
Yeah.
Yeah, uh, that sentence about really starting to feel your emotions for the first time, just knowing what emotions feel like, that resonated so
Mm,
so deeply with me because I feel like for myself, it wasn't really until I started engaging with body-based therapy modalities in my own healing practice, mainly somatic mindfulness. So taking somatic therapy, somatic experiencing, and then mindfulness, and kind of combining the two together to formulate, oh, I have this feeling in this place, and what how, playing with that awareness and that understanding to then deeper understand what that feeling means, how it relates emotionally, how it relates intuitively. And ever since doing that, ever since getting into the practice of prioritizing stepping back into my body, and somebody who talks about this a lot in her work is Tara Brach. She's
mm,
a Buddhist psychologist, and she uses a lot of body awareness in her meditations and in her practices and in her workshops, and that's was one of the big influences in me starting to do that. But once I really started to cultivate that practice of living in the body for as long as I can, staying fully in the body, yeah, it just changes the way you experience things and the way you comprehend them as well. I've
mm,
noticed. And so I personally think, there's some people who claim that they're much more cognitively oriented people. I personally think every single person would really benefit from cultivating their body awareness, no matter how analytical they think they are. And you can be analytical and still cultivate that inner body relationship. There's a difference between feeling your body and then feeling inside your body, you
I
know.
I I, I totally understand that. And for me, that was so much what my journey has been in growing up as, and my wife still calls, she still calls me her Jewish intellectual, and it is, I mean, the culture that we grew up in was, yes, it was very loving and caring, but it was also making sure I read the entire Sunday Times every week, and making sure that I did this, and making sure, and it was, being a philosophy major at Yale and all that, that was all really separated from my feelings, like really just understanding. I mean, that's where the gift is. That's where life is. That's where, and that is in your body. And that's the thing I didn't understand. I thought feelings were what people said that they were, which was more beliefs. Like, I feel like having ice cream, or I feel like going to the park, or I feel stupid. Those aren't feelings, those are beliefs, right? And feelings actually are in your body. Like, they literally are in your body. And it's like, I kept thinking, once I discovered this, it's like, why aren't we taught that? Like, why are we
Right.
like, why isn't that what first grade is, instead of learning the color red and the color blue and the color green, and right? Why aren't they supporting us and exploring our feelings, which is what then builds the foundation of your understanding once you have that experience. It was like this totally frustrating, like, and then I get out of it, out of that frustration with conversations like this, and something Clara said, which was, this was just a grand experiment. It just, yeah, it's probably good that it's over, but that whole separation of our feelings from our brain and our work from our life and this and that, and, this whole civilization we built up about separating and analyzing everything. Let's just consider that a really cool experiment. We realize we can do it.
That's a great way to look at it. It definitely, oh, yeah, because then it also kind of separates that from the present and like that was an experiment, but now it's over and I don't have to identify with that anymore. That's beautiful. Oh.
Exactly. A shaman friend of mine who had gone through chronic fatigue syndrome told me that she cured her chronic fatigue syndrome by talking about it in the past tense. And she would tell people that, yeah, she used to be really tired and she used to have this and used to have that. And it was sort of an NLP way to heal herself.
Mhm.
And now I'm seeing maybe we can heal Western civilization by changing the words and talking about all this stuff in the past tense.
Right? They call it spelling for a reason. You cast spells when you use words.
I love that. I had never heard that connection. Wow. Well, this has been so enlightening and encouraging and beautiful and wonderful and profound. Is there any last thoughts that you want to share? Something left out?
I feel I feel pretty complete.
Awesome.
Yeah, I feel complete.
And we will, when people are seeing this interview, there'll be ways to reach you and links to how to work with you if people are inspired to do that. So I believe many will be. So
Oh.
thank you so much for sharing yourself with all of us, bringing your gifts to us.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure, David. It's nice to get to know you more, see your face, not just a little, vibrating picture.
Yay. And we'll hang out a lot on Scoby with all these other
Mm,
wonderful people who we're going to meet and introduce each other to.
right. And I love that it's called SCOBY, like kombucha SCOBYs is what
Exactly.
I think of. Yeah.
Because what are we except a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast? That's what SCOBY stands for. So, kind of brings it down to basics.
I'm such a fan.
Great. All right. Well, thank
Awesome.
you so much.
Thank you.